let's have a look at timer events in JavaScript. That's what we're going to focus on. So these are the commands we're going to look at. In general, the idea is simple. It's doing something later, possibly many times. That's the general idea. So we call that timers. Very, very useful for dynamic web page behavior. So how do we construct a timer in JavaScript? We make a variable and then we use the variable to point to a timer. All right, we just set up a timer and then that timer is going to run some JavaScript code, such as a function, a little bit later. So this part here is setting up something to happen later. What's going to happen? This function is going to be executed. When is it going to happen? It's going to happen 1000 later. Now that is a value in milliseconds, so it is actually 1 second. 1000 is 1 second. So 1 second later, this function will be executed. Now, when it does this, it doesn't wait. You can do other things with your JavaScript code, many different things, and then suddenly 1 second later, that code will be executed. All right? So that's the idea, doing something a little bit later in time. So here's an example. Let's run this example. Here it is. How long do you want to sleep? All right, so you can type in a value such as perhaps, I don't know, 8,000, something like that. And then press OK. And remember, we're going to use that value to set the delay for a timer. So we do OK, nothing happens, can't see anything happening, but we have set up a timer. And 8 seconds later, boom, up comes a message, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. It's a silly example, but it just shows the idea of a delay before that JavaScript function is executed. Okay, let's go back to our presentation. So that was simple, so let's have a look at that. There's our web page. When we loaded our web page, we ran some code. What does the code do? It sets things up. All right, functions can have any name. This is just a kind of silly name. And so what does that do? Well, it shows the question, how long do you want to sleep? And then we put whatever that person types. We're using prompt, so they can type something. Whatever they type gets stored in a variable. And then we use that variable for the duration of a timer. In other words, we say after that many milliseconds, we're going to run this function here. Where is this function? This function is down here. Very simple. It just makes a little window. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Very simple little example. There's the key part where we do a delay and we run that function after the number which is entered by the user. All right, let's carry on. Let's do a kind of more advanced example, if you like. Now let's show this one first. So here is the example. As you can see, there is a picture. That picture is moving over to the right. How do we control the speed? Well, that's controlled with a timer. So let's have a look at the code which makes this work. So when we load that web page, what do we see? Well, there's our web page and we see basically a picture, an image. That is the image of the stones, and we apply some style rules so that our JavaScript code can move the position by adding position absolute and reset the left position. That's the one that we change with our JavaScript code. So that sets things up. When the web page is loaded, start the timer. And it runs this function here. What does it do? It finds, in memory, it finds that picture of the stones using getElementById. And then it updates a variable which is storing the X position of the image. There's the variable here, start with the value 0. And then every time this function is executed, we increase it by 1. And what do we do with that? Well, we use that variable, X position, we use it and we put it in the left property, right? The left attribute. In other words, the X position of the image. We find the image and then we change the style.left, the X position of the image. So that will update it at the new position, which is moved a little bit over to the right. Now, what do we do finally down here, the last line of code? Well, we set up a timer, and that timer is for the next time. because we want to continually move that image. We set up a timer. After a very small piece of time, 1/20th of a second, I think, after 1/20th of a second, it will run the same function again, right? Set timer. This is inside set timer. It is running the same function again a little bit later. All right, so a little bit later, run this function again, and then it will increase the X. It will update the X position of the image, and it will run itself again, increase X, update position again, and we have a special kind of timer loop. So that's what we saw when we just run the example. Okay, so let's say you want to stop that movement, because that movement goes on forever unless you stop it. Maybe you want to stop that movement, stop a timer. Well, if you've started a timer in the way that we showed, you start a timeout and you just give it a name to point to that timer. If you do that, then all you have to do to stop that movement or whatever you're doing, you just say clear timeout, and then you use the name that you used when you made the timer in the first place. Okay, so we use the word timer, so we use the word timer here, and that will immediately stop that loop process. It will stop the timer. Here's an example where we do that. We add a button to stop that. So let's have a look. Okay, so here is this example, and you can see it's the same as before. Picture moving to the right-hand side, but I just added a button here, and that button, when we click on it, it triggers an event, and we run some code. So let's do it. Let's press stop, and now you can see, yeah, the picture is not moving anymore. I have, in effect, stopped the timer process. I've stopped the timer. Let's carry on with the presentation. So here's our code. And as I said, as we saw just now, we've added a button, simple button. Click on the button, then it runs some code. What does the code do? It clears the timer. And where did we get this thing from, the timer? Well, that was the one that we used, the variable name that we used when we made the timer. Okay, so as long as we use the same name, then we can clear timeout, clear this particular timer, because you can have as many timers as you like at the same time. So that's adding a clear of the timer. Let's carry on. What else could we do? Well, that works fine. It's totally okay. There is another alternative, set interval, and it's very, very similar. How do we set it up? Well, we just do set interval. That's different to set timeout. Set interval. We run this code and we've got a number. So far, it looks identical to set timeout. But the difference is, after you've done this, every 2 seconds, it will run this code. Every 2 seconds. Not just once, again and again and again and again. Okay? So the other question is, how do we stop it? Something's happening again and again and again. How do we stop it? Well, we would use clear, again, clear interval this time, because it's interval. And again, you clear that variable that you used to start it. Let's do a quick example. Let's have a look. So here is our example. It is exactly the same as before. The only difference, it looks the same as before, but the difference is in the coding. We have now used set interval to trigger the repeating pattern, instead of using set timeout every single time. Let's have a look at the code. So basically, we rewrote a previous example so that it used set timeout. So we load the web page, and let's look at the code, which is a bit different. When the web page has loaded, we set up an interval. We set up an interval. Every 50 milliseconds, we will run the code, and the code is the same as before. It's responsible for changing the X value +1, and then moving the image by that new X value. Now, because we use set interval, that automatically runs that function every 50 milliseconds. So up here in this function that we built, I've removed the loop function right here. I said here before, set timeout, so it runs it again. Set timeout, set timeout, set timeout. We don't need to do that anymore because we've set up an interval. It automatically does that repetition process every 50 milliseconds. Then the only thing that I changed also was the button. Click on the button. What does it do? Clear interval instead of clear timeout. Okay, clear interval. All right, apart from that, it's the same visual result. It's just using interval and clear interval instead of set timeout. You really have a choice of which ones to use. So that's the end of our discussion about timers in JavaScript.